Conformément à l'article 108.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083, we are going to study the subject matter of the interim estimates 2019-20, Vote 1, under the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. We have with us the Commissioner of Official Languages, Raymond Théberge, and I will let Mr. Théberge introduce himself and the people he is with. As usual, we will give you about 10 minutes and then we'll move on to questions and comments with members of the committee. Mr. Théberge, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, good morning. Monsieur le Président, honorable membres du comité, bonjour.
Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, hello.
Present the highlights of the main estimates for my office and to talk about a possible federal, provincial, territorial summit. Joining me today are my three assistant commissioners, Ghislaine Séclé, Pierre Leduc, and Éric Trépanier, and my general counsel, Pascal Giguère. My office has a budget of $21.7 million to carry out its mandate during the 2019-2020 fiscal year. This amount includes $15.1 million in salaries, which is nearly 70% of the main estimates. An additional $4.3 million for operating expenses accounts for almost 20% of the main estimates. The remaining $2.3 million, or just over 10% of the main estimates, represents statutory expenditures related to the employer's contribution to employee benefit plans. These funds are used to support my office in carrying out its mandate through its two programs: protection of official languages rights and advancements of English and French in Canadian society, which are supported by internal services. Other than the statutory expenditures I mentioned earlier, the budget for 2019-2020 is essentially the same as last year's. Protection activities include investigations, audits, and other compliance-related activities, as well as legal services. Planned spending in 2019-2020 for this program is $7.6 million, or 35% of the total budget. Planned spending for advancement activities is $7.2 million in 2019-2020, and $6.9 million has been allocated for internal services, which respectively represent 33% and 32% of the total budget. Nous sommes soucieux d'utiliser les fonds publics avec la plus grande probabilité.
Because we are committed to using public funds with the utmost integrity, we have also developed a culture of continuous improvement. Some measures have already been put in place, such as continued investment in information management and information technology, to make business processes more efficient and effective. We will continue to ensure sound management of our budget based on the priorities I will establish. Of course, if we had a bigger budget, we would undoubtedly be able to resolve some investigation files more quickly and to conduct more research, as well as studies and audits. The latter three often take a back seat when we need to focus our resources on investigating complaints and following up on the commitments and recommendations made during those investigations. As an ombudsman, I have to focus my resources on the two programs through which my mandate is carried out. Complaints have been on the rise since 2012, from upwards of 400 to over 1,000. For now, based on the improvements we've made to manage our complaint files, I am confident that my staff and I can continue to fulfill our mandate within the current funding envelope. However, if the trend continues, we will understandably have to consider asking for additional funding. If I may, I'd like to come back to the discussion we had here last December. In 2018, official language minority communities across Canada experienced many setbacks due to various budget cuts and government decisions that weakened the status of our official languages, despite the fact that the Official Languages Act has been around for 5 decades. Obviously, I am dismayed and disappointed by this turn of events. I never thought I'd have to make public statements about language rights setbacks in 2018, just as the Act was about to celebrate its 50th anniversary. Sadly, Canadians' language rights are still being infringed. For example, some voters are still being denied their right to vote in the official language of their choice, even though it is a fundamental right. And it is still difficult for many to obtain services in the official language of their choice where required by law.
Situation and the fact that the Official Languages Act is about to turn 50 years old, I think it's time for the government to take action on a national level and establish a dialogue with the provinces and territories, perhaps in the form of a federal provincial territorial summit, in order to discuss the future of linguistic duality and of official language communities, and to come up with concrete and long-lasting solutions. The federal government has already taken some positive steps with respect to official languages. For example, it has announced its intention to modernize the Act and has recently begun conducting national discussions on official languages and bilingualism. It has also begun implementing the Action Plan for Official Languages 2018-2023, Investing in Our Future, which provides significant funding for official language communities. Given these positive steps, I see an opportunity for the Prime Minister to exercise strong political leadership to reaffirm linguistic duality across the country. In order for linguistic duality to be meaningful and to be something that brings us together, Canada's official languages must claim their rightful place. Without strong support for official language minority communities across Canada, our linguistic duality cannot succeed, and the social contract that brings us together is weakened. As you know, the Act is a federal statute, but the way Canadians live their lives in their own official language is very dependent on provincial and municipal governments, in school, at work, at play, online, even while simply ordering a coffee. How then do we ensure that our two languages have their own place in these public spaces, where the power of federal law is limited? This is an issue that could be discussed at a summit. I've said before and I'll say it again. Official languages are everyone's business. Je tiens à ajouter que les provinces,
The provinces and territories have an important role to play in protecting official language minority communities by making sure that linguistic duality is always on the agenda. They need to recognize the economic and cultural contribution of these communities across Canada. I think that a federal, provincial, territorial summit could yield tangible results among key stakeholders, such as increased awareness and a renewed commitment to linguistic duality. Investing in the future, in young Canadians, and in our communities ensures the vitality and longevity of Canada's official languages.
nous devons demeurer
And so, we must continue to be vigilant to prevent federal and provincial authorities from making decisions and taking actions that undermine official language minority communities. We need to strengthen these communities, not weaken them. And we need leaders from all levels of government to make this happen. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the official language of your choice, and I'll be happy to answer them.
If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the official language of your choice, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Théberge. On va...
Thank you very much, Mr. Théberge. We will immediately start questions with Mr. Alupa. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Commissioner. Welcome to all of our guests to this new room. It's the first time we've held a meeting here. I would like to start by asking you, Mr. Théberge, how many employees do you have? 165. That's substantial. And this is a question that doesn't have anything behind it, but I see in the main estimates for 2018, 2019, that the money you had was 19 million. And we see that the lobbying commissioner is 4 million. Integrity has has 5 billion. What explains that disparity? Our mandate is to protect and promote. A long time ago, the government decided to fund us to ensure that we can fulfill our mandate when it comes to protecting and promoting. We also have a longer history than other officers of Parliament. More employees, I would imagine, as well? Yes, more employees. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen significant increases in the number of complaints. And some other commissioners have noted the same thing about the increased number of complaints, and they're also looking for additional funding. That's interesting. Mr. Commissioner, as you said in your introductory remarks, you talked about the fact that you didn't think that you would take the position in a year like this one where we see language rights being infringed upon. Have you noted an increase in the number of complaints in that same year relative to other years? Yes, indeed. This year, which ended on March 31st, we had a record number of complaints, 1,086 complaints. We've never seen that before. Obviously, this leads to investigations that need to follow specific steps. We need to make sure that they are always well done. Canadians are more and more aware of their rights, and they are more and more ready to assert their rights. And in which sector would you say, what part of the law do these complaints target? Over 50% of the complaints have to do with Section 4, communications and services. Over 50%. Section 4. Interesting. For the next year, you're looking for 21.7 million. Are you asking for that? Is that what the government is giving you? Is it enough? Are you satisfied? Is it not enough or too much? Well, it's never too much, but you know what I mean. Mr. Trépanier will answer part of the question, and then I will also respond. When it comes to the 21.7 million, that's the annual amount that is allocated with a few variations when collective agreements are signed. However, this is essentially the same amount from year to year. The only variations have to do with increased salaries. And to answer the second part of your question, is that enough? As I mentioned, right now, we are able to manage the increased number of complaints. However, there are still sectors in which we could do more. For example, in studies, research, audits, follow-ups. What's important is that we have to understand the environment in which we work. Research is extremely important. We sponsor research. We're not necessarily doing it ourselves, and it's extremely important to be able to use evidence that is produced by the community of researchers. We need an evidence base in order to better orient our work. However, as I mentioned, if this trend is maintained, we will have to increase the number of investigators on the one hand, and on the other, we cannot neglect promotion. One thing that I noted this year is just how, when I travel throughout the country, how official languages are not understood by the majority. We often talk amongst ourselves. We know official languages well, but the majority often does not understand the concept of official languages, of duality, and even official bilingualism. It's important to be able to promote this among the majority as well as among the minority. Another question, Mr. Commissioner. In the case of the Infrastructure Bank, the National Energy Board, websites for calls for tender, there's translation problems, and sometimes there's outright arrogance, as in the case of NEB. Do you have the power? Do you send them a letter signed by you asking, what's your problem? Well, currently, the two cases you mentioned are under investigation. I don't have a lot of comment about that yet, but what's important to note is that when we talk about complaints, about 30% of complaints are resolved by facilitated resolution. It's as simple as somebody sees that a website is not in both official languages, they make a phone call and it's resolved. The complainant just wants a letter saying the problem is solved. Not only do we have the official aspect. We have the unofficial aspect where there's more flexibility. With a formal investigation, we have to follow specific steps. Thank you, Alupa. We'll now move on to Mona Fortier. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think Alupa and I are on the same wavelength. I had many questions that were along the same lines, but I will continue to insist on those points. Thank you for being here. As I said when I arrived, it's as though you had a bonus card and you come and see us often. Now, when it comes to investigations, the fact that the number is increasing, this isn't just about last year. I would imagine that over the last several years, that there's been an increase, a steady increase. Since 2012, 2013, in fact, we've noticed increases. One year we had 1,000, then we had 800 some, and this year we have a 21% increase. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, have we hit a new cap? What's the new normal? Before it was 500 complaints a year, maybe even 100 in some cases. But if the new normal is 1,000 complaints a year, that requires us to function a little differently. The question I'm asking is, if next year, are we going to have the same increase? Is it going to maintain itself? But if the new normal is 1,000 complaints, in my opinion, we will certainly have to ask the question, do we have enough resources to do our work?
I understand that 50% is based on Part 4. Or were there any surprises in terms of the complaints? Was there anything new that came out, I don't know, in over the last year or two with regard to the complaints you've received? I wouldn't say so. One thing that we see is that often there are new institutions created. When these new institutions are created, they're not necessarily aware of their obligations. Also, as I mentioned, the world in which we are working is changing. There is the traveling public, for example, an area in which we receive a lot of complaints. This is because the environment where travelers are traveling has changed a lot over the recent years, and the Act does not give the tools to deal with that new reality. When a new institution is created, it seems to me, not necessarily in all cases, but quite often, these institutions are not aware of their obligations. Thank you. You talked about the modernization of the Act. I think there are different roles being played. What are you focusing on in the next year? How do you see the modernization? Will it be research, activities on the ground? What are your priorities? And how much capacity will you need to achieve that? With regard to the modernization, in 2018, we had a very broad consultation, two ways. One, we met with over 300 individuals in person, and many stakeholders, associations, specialized researchers, and so forth, to get their opinion on the modernization. Second, there was an online poll. Over 4,200 Canadians responded to that poll. They were asked the important elements that we need to look at in terms of modernizing. I will table in May the report of the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, which takes into consideration these consultations, but also consultations that were led by other stakeholders, for example, the Senate committee. This committee also has looked at modernizing. The CFA and other groups as well have looked at it. The next year, of course, will be after the elections, and we will have to continue and restart to ensure that we can move forward. We know that we've begun the modernization process on the right foot. We need to move forward after 2020. Well, there's the question of what you could do with the money, but what can you not do because you don't have the money? If you had more money, what would you do? As I said, if we had additional funds, we could, no doubt, increase our efforts in the area of research, communications, promotion. But also, when I talk about promotion, it's important to note that the commissioner will never have the resources of a government or a department to do promotion. So if we talk about promotion and a national campaign, I think that this is the responsibility of the federal government or departments to do this promotion. But we must use these conclusive data, have the tools and the capacity to do the research, to do the audits, and the follow-ups. One of the concerns that I'd like your observations on, and probably we don't have the time, but with regard to this conclusive data, there is linguistic variability, the absence of powers to get it through the census, for example. Perhaps we don't have enough data in order to make the connections in research or in other areas. This linguistic variation becomes an issue. So perhaps this morning, if you have a comment to make on this, it would be appreciated. Because I know he's going to cut me off. That's why I'm saying that. Please be brief. A few years ago, there were talks with Statistics Canada to better identify this linguistic variability. It's extremely important with regard to identification, for example, of francophones. Second, to determine service areas, geographic regions, and so forth. This linguistic variability must take into consideration the evolution of these communities over time. It must take into consideration immigration, for example. For example, there are a number of people who have immigrated, and French is not their first language, but they speak French. So it's important to be able to capture all of that variability around language. Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to François Choquette. Good day, everyone. I won't talk to you about Netflix because everybody knows I asked for this to be looked at by the courts. Of course, it's not personal. It's not against the commissioner, but to move forward the issue of official languages, French in particular. There are no results with regard to creating this kind of service despite the money. We'll do everything we can to move this forward, and that's why I have started this suit. I would like to talk to you about other files. You talked about complaints, more complaints than before. It's complicated, it's difficult. Some complaints take a long time. And for the complainants, it's very frustrating. It can be inexplicable and even shocking. I'd like to give you two examples. The first is this. It concerns the RCMP complaint. You are well aware of it. My former colleague and a colleague in my heart, Yvan Godin, who had filed this complaint, and he sent you a letter. It's public, so I can read it. And in the letter states that I am stupefied to realize that the RCMP has ignored your recommendations from your March 2017 report. I understand that the important problems were brought to the attention of by the RCMP and the Prime Minister by 2015. What is your feeling when you make two very easy, simple recommendations and they're talking about putting in place a procedure to remind people of their official language's responsibility and an oversight mechanism to confirm that services are indeed available? How do you feel when you see these kinds of things? We're talking about a federal institution. Well, when we talk about a follow-up to the recommendations made by my office, there are two types of responses. First of all, in 80% of the cases, the federal institutions will implement the recommendations. Yet, in 20% of the cases, we have some difficulties seeing action on implementation. Too often, we see in recent years that there's a kind of maximum reached when it comes to official languages within the federal institutions. Second, too often the measures that are put in place federally are not sustainable and do not resolve the problem. Unfortunately, in some cases, as I think in this case that you have mentioned, the commissioner has only some powers with regard to... I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, and I apologize if it seems impolite, but Yvan Godin has added that the Office of the Commissioner must get essential information from the RCMP, even if the RCMP resists. What is your response to this? In the sense that, why aren't you asking for them to... There is the obligation to provide further information on the bilingual capacity on the Hill. Why don't you do that? Well, the request was made. You did make that request? Yes, absolutely we did, and we're still waiting for the answer from the RCMP to this preliminary report. I would add, perhaps, the complication in this file is that there was the creation of the Parliamentary Protective Services at the same time or very shortly after this complaint was filed. So we're waiting to talk with the RCMP, but also with the Parliamentary Protective Services with regard to the transformation that is occurring, the transformation in the role of the RCMP following the creation of this new agency. Between 2015 and the time when this report was tabled, there have been a number of discussions with the two agencies in question, and we are waiting for an answer to those two recommendations by the RCMP to complete our report. It goes back to 2015, so it's really bad faith from the government here. There's another issue that I want to talk to you about, which is very concerning to me. It's the music industry. It's another public issue. That's why I'm talking to you about it. They published a press release. They talked about the fact that their request was public. You had a preliminary report in March 2018 condemning the fact that Part 7 had not been respected with regard to Sirius and participation in the fund. Recently, in February 2019, and I quote, there was a modified investigative report with regard to the 2013 complaint. Of course, it's a very old complaint again. Mr. Thibault has changed his decision that he had given a year before, and the complaint is now unfounded. Does this often happen, that a complaint is found, has been found to have a basis, and of course, then there is no foundation for the report? Does this often happen, that first you say, well, of course, there is a basis for this complaint, I'm going to investigate, there are recommendations that will be put in place, and then later you change your opinion? The answer is not often. But in this case, and in a few other cases in the past year, this has happened, and it is in large part due to the decision, the Gascon decision. This means that we have to reassess reports based on Part 7, and this changes the rules of interpretation. This report that you have mentioned was a preliminary report since 2013, Mr. Commissioner. What concerns me is that you've come to see us and you're telling us, well, if this continues, I will need more help, more money to investigate complaints. You have a complaint like this, which is very serious, which has been demonstrated, and you said it yourself in the report, that there was no consultation. And this is from 2013, and Sirius has not participated in the Music Fund. And it's been years that there have been damages, harm done since 2013. This is what concerns me. Why don't you ask for more funding now so that you can more quickly deal with complaints and act? Here, you have just asked in 2019 for the figures from the RCMP, but it goes back to 2015. I'll take that as a comment, says the chair, and I need to go to the next speaker. Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Thibault and his colleagues. I appreciate always your presence in order to respond to questions and share with us your vision, as you have done with regard to modernizing the Act. It's very appreciated. I would also stress the fact that you indicated in your presentation that the government has made steps with regard to the action plan that showed a major investment in official language minority communities and has reviewed the Modernizing the Official Languages Act. I think these two actions are very positive and demonstrate that we want to contribute to this vitality in a very efficient and rapid manner. Two questions I'd like to ask. First concerns this duality. It is increasingly important. You talked about that in your presentation. The fact that I would say the majority of Quebecers in particular, as well as the Anglophone majority, aren't really aware of the importance of linguistic duality, of bilingualism. It's 50 years later. How could we focus on this, selling this, because it's a asset? I'm not convinced that everybody sees this as an asset. Do you have a few comments on that, please? If we look, for example, at what we're doing with regard to the majority, the means of the Office of the Commissioner are very limited. We go into schools, we meet with groups, but there are consultations, for example, the ones that are underway by Ms. Jody. When I look at who's in the room, it's almost always members of the Francophone communities outside Quebec in particular. So when we talk about linguistic duality, there are two sides. Of course, we have to make sure that during these consultations that there are representatives of the majority beyond the Canadian Parents for French. These are very key partners. Another important element is teaching second language in Canada. There is a maximum number of people who are bilingual. We have to increase that number, particularly among Anglophones outside Quebec. In order to do this, we need significant investments in teaching a second language, training teachers, but also through the school system, we can promote linguistic duality. Another point, and this is probably the task of the federal government, is to have an awareness campaign about the importance of linguistic duality. It must be understood by everybody, not just by the Francophones. I 100% agree with you. This linguistic duality among Anglophones and perhaps among Quebecers they're not sold on the idea, but perhaps we can work on this. My second question deals with complaints. You said, if I understood correctly, that 30% of the complaints are quickly resolved and so forth, and other 50% of complaints are resolved over time. But you said that 80% in general of the cases are resolved, but the 20% that is unresolved, that's what I want to focus on here. What types of problems are part of this 20%, and what institutions in particular are involved? Could we have a table, for example, that gives us an overview of the institutions and the problems that are more complex and that fall into this 20% category? And perhaps the next step could be to respond to the challenges facing these 20%. With regard to the 20%, there are systemic failures. If we talk about systemic failures, there is a solution to this. I'll give you an example of a complaint we frequently receive with regard to job classification in the public service. It's Section 91. We looked at this, and we get a lot of these complaints. It requires a new approach to more quickly resolve these complaints. It's a pilot project at present. We'll see what the results are, but we hope that we'll be able to quickly resolve this kind of complaint. There are some federal institutions where we see recurrent complaints, be it Air Canada, the Canadian Forces. Here we're talking about systemic issues. We have to find then solutions to these issues. I apologize if my time has almost run out, but my question is it possible to get a table of this 20%, these systemic issues, and what institutions are involved? Because if this really is the real problem, perhaps the next thing we need to do is to go and find solutions to these problems. Perhaps we could provide you with a table of the federal institutions for which we get the most complaints and the types of complaints that we hear about, because these 20% concern the follow-up of recommendations, not necessarily related to the number of complaints, but we can provide you with this table. Thank you. You could give it to the clerk, who would be pleased, of course, to provide each and every member of the committee with a copy. Thank you. Now we will move on to Manuela. Thank you. Thank you once again for coming to speak with us and respond to questions.
The question that I'm going to focus on mainly is the summit that you've been wanting to hold, and I wanted to know what exactly would be the benefits for Anglophones in Quebec and Francophones outside of Quebec if this summit is held. If you can go a little bit more into detail.
So, what as I mentioned earlier, the whole question of linguistic duality is not really understood by a lot of Canadians, and I think that is reflected by some of the actions taken by provincial and territorial governments. I think we've come a long way over the last 50 years, but also I think we've reached a point where we've sort of forgotten what this duality is all about. And I think if you could bring around the table representatives from the provinces, the territories, and the federal government to basically revisit linguistic duality and relaunch it in a sense that it becomes more visible, it becomes more present in for example, in Canadian society. One of the things that's very important is over the last year, a lot of the incidents happened in provinces. And it's, in my view, in most provinces, because there was a lack of understanding of what linguistic duality is all about. And I think in Quebec, for example, with the English-speaking minority, they also have their challenges in terms of being recognized within the province as being a key contributor to the province. I think there'll be challenges with the whole question of school boards that's coming down the road. But I think the whole question is we have to reinvigorate the concept of linguistic duality in Canada. We have to give it life, and it has to be more than just something that the federal government does. It has to be appropriated by provinces and territories. And I think we could have an agenda. It doesn't have to be, we're not talking about a 3-day meeting. I'm talking about an agenda where we can talk about access to justice. We can talk about education, first, second language. We talk about early childhood. We can talk about healthcare in with respect to official languages. Just be able to bring some visibility bring some visibility and some focus on the concept of linguistic duality. Bring it back to life.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
Le suivant, c'est
The next one is Bernard Généreux. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you all for being here today. I'd like to follow up on Emanuela's questions. I also have a difficult question. As Mona mentioned, you were on Tout le monde en parle earlier. When it comes to the federal-provincial relationship as part of a summit, I don't know if members of the committee recall this, but we went to Western Canada 2 years ago, and I had raised the idea of a federal-provincial summit on education. I'm happy to see that you're proposing the same idea today. Because here's the difficult question. Is it utopian to believe that language rights for minorities, whether they be Anglophone or Francophone throughout the country, will be upheld, such that the federal government gives money to the provinces who then don't have to be accountable to the federal government when it comes to spending? in order to make sure that this money is spent appropriately. You understand my question? It's a long one, but it's a difficult one, potentially. That said, I am persuaded. I was here in from 2009 to 2011, and we've been here for the last 4 years to try and move this cause forward. And when the federal government has no control over the money that it spends in education through the provinces to whom it gives this money, how can we actually move the cause forward? On that, we've had a lot of discussions during our consultations when it came to modernizing the Act. One point that came back repeatedly were language clauses in federal provincial agreements. The power to spend is the federal government's power. If the federal government decides to invest in communities, it can also demand accountability. When it comes to accountability, we need to agree on language clauses when we transfer funds from the federal government to the provinces, which is supposed to help a language minority. Do these clauses exist right now, or do they not exist? Some agreements do have clauses which, in my opinion, are very ambiguous and vague. But in the next few agreements, it will be a lot more clear when it comes to where the money should be invested. We also have to make sure that the provinces and territories, when the federal government invests, especially in education, do have some responsibility. Of course, education is a provincial responsibility, but it's a federal investment, and the provinces and territories are accountable, and they should be more transparent about the way that they invest these funds and spend these funds. Imagine that tomorrow morning, the federal government decides to hold a summit, a pan-Canadian summit with the provinces and territories, and even the municipalities or school boards, because school boards are indeed involved in this file, and they're the first ones to complain, for the vast majority, that they're not getting the money when they should. Would you expect that most of the stakeholders agree to participate in this summit just automatically? Or do you think we'd have to tug on a few people's ears to say, hey, you should be there? I think that the summit should, above all, unite those who have an important role to play in promoting linguistic duality. However, knowing our reality quite well here in Canada, perhaps certain steps need to be taken to make sure we have all the players around the table. Pardon me, when you talk about players, which players would you expect exactly? The ministers of education of each province? Well, there's different approaches. Currently, there's the Conference of Ministers for the Francophonie, which could be an interesting forum. There's the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada, which is a forum that does deal with education. And they also deal with official languages in education. I don't think that the office necessarily has the mandate to organize such a conference. However, I think our situation is, if it was asked of you, would you do it? If with the budget, of course. Well, who would confer such a mandate to the Commissioner's office to organize an FPT conference? The federal government is responsible for organizing those types of meetings if the will is there. But to organize a forum to do so, that's an excellent idea. Thank you, Mr. Bernard. We're going to move on to Jean Rioux. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Always delighted to have you because you represent an important institution in Canada. And I think that we are all proud of bilingualism, which is part of our identity here. The law is going to celebrate its 50th anniversary this year. You mentioned earlier that 2017 was a horrible year for bilingualism. When we talk about the lack of funding for the university, the Francophone University of Ontario, when we think about the Ontario Official Languages Commissioner, which lost its independence, and the situation in New Brunswick with the election of 3 MPPs that are anti-French Canadian. These are worrisome. However, I think that as part of the visits that I did in Western Canada, even Vancouver, that there's some cause for optimism. If we look at Vancouver, the number of Francophiles increased. The number of people of Asian origin who want to learn French is on the rise. And we're also seeing that immersion schools were problematic. It's not the demand that is lacking, but how do you see these elements that we've observed in Ontario and New Brunswick and so on that show that there's not a significant turn of the tide in favor of bilingualism, which is part of our identity as Canadians? Well, the events of 2018 did have a positive effect in the sense that it created solidarity among Francophones from one end of the country to another, including what we saw on Tout le monde en parle. Francophones have made their presence felt as a result of these events. Over the last 4 years, we've seen a 20% increase in registrations to French immersion schools. There's many students that are registered. The problem is the lack of teachers. We started a study recently on the lack of FSL teachers. We received a great deal of extraordinary media coverage. We started the study in Vancouver, actually, because in Vancouver, there's a real interest for immersion. Immersion is a significant thing. It's a lever that we need to use to promote linguistic duality. We need to ensure that French as a second language programs offer quality programming. And I think that's been one of the problems. We haven't provided enough opportunities to young Canadians to learn French as a second language or to learn a second language at all, such that today we have a lack of bilingual staff all over Canada. If we come back to schools, what we heard many times is that Francophone school boards in minority situations could not act on decisions, and they weren't getting funds. There was a lack of governance and transparency. In this file, is it the province or the federal government that should intervene to ensure that young people who want to go to an immersion school or to a French language school, because I'm told in Vancouver, 1 child out of 5 wanted to go to a French language school, could go because of the lack of schools available. Is the ball more in the provincial government's court or the federal government? It's both, in the sense that if the federal government invests and does so in French at the kindergarten level, French as a second language, and act transparently, act with accountability, include language clauses to make sure that funds that are intended for education are actually spent in education for students in the community, not necessarily taking those funds and putting them in some sort of general fund. We need to make sure that funds targeted to Francophone education for either mother tongue or second language learning are actually spent there. Madame Boucher, you have 5 minutes. Thank you. I'm very glad to see you here today. You come to see us often, so we must be very nice. And we find that it's very nice of you to answer our questions because we have many. Earlier, you mentioned that 50% of complaints were filed under Section 4. You said that linguistic duality throughout Canada is misunderstood. We talked a great deal about governments in place. Now, how would I put it? Governments do what they can, but the machinery is often resistant to change, linguistic change. When I lost the election in 2011, I went to work for Health Canada, and I can tell you everything was done in English, or just about everything. And when I spoke French, I was told, oh, that's the francophone from Quebec, because they automatically think that somebody who speaks French is from Quebec. There's mentalities to change, but we always see the same organizations when we hold consultations. It's always the same people who are fighting the fight. How could you give us an idea in order to ensure that the people that we want to serve get more involved? Not necessarily organizations, but the everyday person on the ground who understands the importance of linguistic duality. An important thing would be to focus on the services we offer the public. Very often, services are not available in the language of one's choice. Often, when people want a service in their language, it's considered a political act. When we look at the modernization of legislation, we want to ensure that Section 4 and Section 5 work together. Section 5 is about the language of work. If with the language of work, we can ensure that people can use the language of work of their choice, we will then be able to offer better services in the language of choice of our fellow citizens. Over the last 10 years, when we look at language matters among public servants, there's no change. In other words, 94%, 92% of Anglophones say that they prefer to that they can work in their language, and only 62% of Francophones can speak their language. When we talk about institutions, we're talking about the machinery. Within that machinery, people need to be able to work in the language of their choice to then be able to offer services to support the requests of communities. We'll move on to François Choquette. Last question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to come back to the forum, the Premier's Forum, the federal, provincial, territorial ministers, and congratulate you for making the request to hold this forum. We really needed it. Unfortunately, time is really flying because we're heading into an election. It would have been great to have it before January, February. It was really the time. For example, when the crisis in Ontario hit its peak, the situation in New Brunswick, I think it was a good request to make when you came to see us. Have you launched this process? I know that you spoke publicly before the committee. Did you send a letter to the federal government to encourage it to act, or did you just invite them? Did you get an answer? I heard earlier from the government side to say that it's not up to you to hold that forum, it's up to the government. You mentioned that it was something that they would need to do, but did they answer you? Did they think it was a good idea, but that the timing wasn't right? Well, there was no official request made. It was reported in the media, and we solicited reactions from various governments. The response was rather tepid when it came to holding such a forum. I think it would have been interesting, as you said, to hold it in January, February. But the year of the 50th anniversary, I mean, the elections are obviously going to go on. I think in the context of modernizing the law, I think that that's an important gesture. I agree with you. And we're going to be heading into an election campaign soon. And I hope that this will be an election promise that all of our candidates will make. That is, to hold a forum as part of the 50th anniversary of the Official Languages Act, because I think it's important. We saw it through all the provinces. As you said, not everybody understands official languages the same way. Same thing for elected officials. It would be good to come back to that. If I have some time left, Mr. Chair, or I have 20 seconds? Okay. Then I just wanted to mention your comments. You mentioned consultations with the minister and the fact that people are not really presenting what you would have liked to see. I would like us to broaden the people that we see in the room in order to have a better representation of Canadian society. I think that it's well perceived. And in passing, I had mentioned the form to Ms. Joly and Ms. Lockhart. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you very much, Mr. Théberge, for your presentation and for answering our questions and comments. Thank you to all of the group. We will now suspend for a few minutes and then proceed to the second hour. Thank you again.
To Standing Order 1083, we resume our study on modernization of the Official Languages Act. I'm pleased to have here today the following witnesses: Stephanie Chouinard, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Royal Military College of Canada and Department of Political Studies, Queen's University, and Jack Jedwab, President and CEO, Immigration and Identities Association for Canadian Studies and Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration. Welcome, both of you. We will give you some 10 minutes to give a presentation, followed by, as usual, questions and comments from colleagues. I don't know who is going to start. As you wish. Ms. Chouinard. Okay. Chair, members of the committees, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking you for the invitation to talk with you about the modernization of the Official Languages Act. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be here today with you. My name is Stephanie Chouinard. Since January 2017, I've been the assistant professor at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, since 2018 at Queen's University, where I teach political science.
Le Collège militaire royal de Kingston.
The Royal Military College, as well as Saint-Jean Military College, are the only institutions, post-secondary institutions, subject to the Official Languages Act. This means that the implementation of the Act is part of my daily life, and I see the success and sometimes also the difficulties, as well as some failures within my workplace. Nonetheless, the goal of my intervention today will not be to talk to you about the sometimes difficult relationship of the Canadian Armed Forces with its linguistic requirements, but rather my expertise in research about renewal of the Official Languages Act. My expertise in research deals with the relationship between rights and minorities. I am a political scientist. I specialize in linguistic rights, which is not as strange as it sounds at first. I am essentially interested in the blind spots of the Official Languages Act. And the major issues that guide my research over recent years are the following: the legal extent to respond to the rights of minorities, the official language minorities in particular, in the countries. What are the limits of the Official Languages Act to respond to the demands of Canadians in official language minority communities? To that effect, I have studied in depth the jurisprudence on linguistic rights in Canada and the impact on public policy. One of my main findings is that we are coming to the end of the interpretation with regard to the Official Languages Act, as well as sections 16 to 23 of the Charter, the interpretation by the judiciary no longer responds to the hopes of official language minorities in Canada, hopes that are translated into requests that are sometimes for autonomy and greater responsibility and greater participation by the state. Official language minority communities, particularly Francophone ones, have turned to the courts in recent years in order to have their rights respected, but decisions have not done what they had hoped. With regard to Part 7, there are some difficulties. There is the Official Languages Commissioner, has had the power since 1988 to investigate and to hear cases. I would like to plead for a revision of the mandate of the Official Languages Commissioner and the creation of an administrative tribunal that would hear cases dealing with allegations of failure to respect official languages minority rights. It's important to understand that there's always been something lacking from the Office of the Commissioner since the creation in 1969. We had imagined that this position would be like an ombudsman who would be persuasive like the Act was back then. In the first iteration, there was judicial recourse. C-72 did not give a power to order by the Commissioner, so the results of the investigation showing failings could remain without response. There would be an improvement of the compliance responsibilities. Since 1988, the Ombudsman's role at the Official Languages Commissioner is somewhat like that of a police, and the federal court, for its part, was given the role of sanctioning failings under the Act. This could lead to prosecution once a complaint had been filed with the Official Languages Commissioner. This is considered a last resort. In 1988, the then Commissioner was very unenthusiastic about the idea of going through the courts, and discretionary power was not clarified under the Act. This tradition has continued to date. There are a few cases where the Commissioner has decided to go to courts himself, preferring to ask for status as an intervener in cases put forward by civilian parties. In 1988, voices were heard to require that the Official Languages Act be binding, but also to ask for the implementation of an administrative court on linguistic rights. This was the case of the FCFA, which is still asking for the creation of this kind of court. There are very simple reasons. This kind of court would be easier to access for Canadians than the federal court. There would be greater sanctions for direct failings under the Act rather than decisions dealing with the main principles of the Act, which we often find happens at the federal court. This kind of amendment would, in my opinion, renew the Official Languages Act, both for Canadians and for political institutions that are required to respect that Act. There could be then orders given for failings under the Act, and there would be a tangible incentive for institutions to respect the Official Languages Act, then an incentive that is currently lacking in the current system, which prefers the carrot to the stick. If we consider the number of bad students we see year after year in the Official Languages Commissioner's report, as we heard earlier today. There is already a linguistic regime where there is a commissioner and a court responsible for language rights. This is in Wales. There was the Welsh Languages Measures established in Cardiff in 2011, which sought to replace the Welsh Language Board. The commissioner was created in 2012, and the court was put in place in 2015. I know that the commissioner, Mary Hughes, was invited to testify before the committee a few days ago. I'm not breaking parliamentary decorum of somebody who is not here in the room? Okay, fine. So Mary Hughes, who testified before you at the end of March, and I saw that you had spoken about the difference in her role compared to the role of the Official Languages Commissioner of Canada, as well as the role of the Language Court in Cardiff. I don't know if this meeting with her allowed you to form an opinion, but for my part, I would urge you to take this model as an example. The role of the Welsh Language Commissioner is to investigate and to sanction, and Mary Hughes, the Commissioner, is judge and party following complaints that have been filed. She hears appeals, and the court hears appeals and decisions, and sanctions are provided for failure to respect the Welsh language. In other words, the court is not responsible to ensure that violations are punished, but rather to oversee what the commissioner does. Who is responsible for imposing sanctions? I invite you not to follow that example. Not only does it duplicate the work of the commissioner, a duplication that is currently problematic in Canada, as the last 30 years have demonstrated, but it has promoted antagonism among different parties in the Welsh civil society by suggesting that it's necessary to oversee the commissioner's office. Nothing like this exists in Canada. The Welsh experience indicates that, in my opinion, it would be wiser to let a court considered neutral on official languages to impose sanctions following investigations by the commissioner. The Official Languages Commissioner of Canada would then remain an ombudsman and an investigator, and the punitive role would then be given to the administrative court that has been put in place to hear cases from different parties. A court of appeal of the administrative tribunal could be given then to the federal court. Goes without saying that the Official Languages Commissioner's mandate needs to be revised in order to specify when the Official Languages Commissioner
et présenter son dossier de preuve au tribunal plutôt que de laisser cette décision à la discrétion du commissaire. Une refonte de la loi sur les langues officielles pourrait ainsi donner un nouveau souffle au commissariat dans ses rôles de promotion et d'enquête et lui imposer une présence devant les tribunaux pour veiller à ce que les preuves et les connaissances diverses qu'il détient en matière de langues officielles, notamment en matière de plaintes récurrentes et de problèmes systémiques, soient utiles à ce tribunal dont la création est proposée. Je vous remercie et je passe la parole à mon collègue, M. Jadwa.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphanie. On va attendre. Oui.
Could you please provide us with the text? Yes, thank you very much.
Pardon? On va l'avoir dans la transcription exactement.
We'll have the transcript.
With Jack Jedwa.
Alors, bonjour, hi, et merci de m'avoir.
Good day. Hi. Thank you for letting me be here. I'm very pleased then to present my observations and my recommendations with regard to the discussions on the Modernizing the Official Languages Act. First, I'd like to start with a series of principles and a vision of the current situation regarding official languages. I'm very proud to be part of our community in Canada. There are approximately 6.2 million. My 4 children, my spouse, and I are all proud to be bilingual and to be part of this community of bilingual people in Canada. And we want to add to our membership. So all of those who are interested in being bilingual, we invite them to join us.
Depuis les années 70, comme on constate, le Canada.
Since the 70s, Canada has undergone a demographic revolution, which we've also observed through immigration, but also through birth rates. That means that the country we're living in now doesn't look exactly like what we saw in the 60s. And I know because I was there in the 70s. And I remember what our demographics were then. With these changes, we've seen a change in discourse and policies when it comes to bilingualism. For instance, I would imagine that some of you remember this as well, that after the introduction of the Official Languages Act, In 71, the multicultural policy of Canada was situated in a bilingual context, but in the 80s, things changed and we focused more on a diverse multiculturalism within the context of 2 official languages and less within just simply bilingualism.
Multiculturalism within the bilingual framework, but more about multiculturalism within the context of language duality or with the predominance of 2 official languages. So we've seen a shift in that area, in large part, I think, to line up against our changing demographics or our uneven geographic distribution of French and English speakers and the degree of bilingualism to which that unevenness has given rise. Right? Because, as our census tells us, about 80% of our population, a little more, un peu plus que 80% de notre population, probablement je suis en train de donner des cauchemars aux gens qui font la...
And I'm giving nightmares to people who are translating when I switch back and forth between English and French. I'm sorry, but that's how. And I speak quickly. So a little more slowly is better, even if I switch between English and French. It's just a matter of not speaking as quickly. I'm used to speaking very quickly. So I'll try to slow down a little.
The majority of the country, about 80% and a little bit above, is actually unilingual, right? Unable to speak both official languages. They may be bilingual or trilingual in other languages, but in terms of our understanding of bilingualism officially, the vast majority is unilingual. Right, the sort of 18% of us that are bilingual are the ones that get more attention because they're more the object of if you like, the critical mass of people that we like to expand through various programs, through our laws, and through the policy delivery mechanisms and program delivery mechanisms that are in place to affect those changes, notably in the education system, which is a provincial jurisdiction, as we know. So we also know that the concentration of our bilingual population is largely in Quebec, Ontario, and New Brunswick. And again, without a large size, given the population of New Brunswick relative to those larger provinces. It's been described as being very concentrated in the bilingual belt. Right? I'm sure it's a term some of us have heard before. Right? And the bilingual belt, I can assure you, as I follow closely the demographic trends, that bilingual belt has not stretched out very much over the years. My belts have stretched out over the years, but not the bilingual one. Right? If Canada can describe itself today, as it likes to do, as a bilingual country, it is largely a function of the concentration of bilinguals in those 3 provinces, and more specifically in the area I've just described. At best, we can describe ourselves as a bilingual country from a de jure standpoint, not so much from a de facto standpoint, given the percentage of people who are bilingual. In fact, paradoxically, my home province of Quebec can describe itself as more de facto bilingual, but not de jure bilingual, given the laws in place, right? Which may seem, a bit counterintuitive, but it's a function of, on the one hand, the geographic distribution of language communities in the country, and on the other hand, the predominance, I would argue, of English in North America. Right. So despite the challenges associated with the expansion of bilingualism, malgré les défis associés avec l'expansion de nombre et
in spite of the challenges associated with the high percentage of people who are bilingual, this remains an extremely important objective. We need to make sure that measures are in place in order to try to improve our percentage and broaden the number of people who are able to speak both official languages. This is important not only for our official languages policies, but also to respond to the needs that belong to official language minority communities. Linguistic duality has its objectives, on the one hand, to broaden the critical mass of people who can speak both languages, and on the other, to ensure the vitality and the continuance of people who belong to official language minority communities. Both objectives are interconnected, such that people who belong to, who identify with official language minority communities want to be able to have interactions in their first language and to have a critical mass of people who speak the other language as a second language. in many places, which in my mind are the most important in order to achieve the objectives we want for official languages and to ensure the vitality and the survival of official language minority communities. We need to do this at work, and we need to have people in the workplace who are able to speak both languages in order to allow people who belong to OLMCs to have interactions in their first language.
As that one example, but there are many, that the two are interconnected objectives, even though we may see them as disconnected objectives on some level in terms of the way the law and the policies and programs are offered, formulated, and delivered. So let me go quickly through three other points. Public opinion and messaging. We're all quite sensitive to public opinion surveys. We see battles of public opinion surveys as to where Canadians stand as regards bilingualism and as regards language minorities. And it's very important, I think, in our messaging, not only in our messaging as thought leaders, as elected officials, but as reflected in our laws, that we're quite clear and unambiguous about our commitments. And so I would say that one of the things that's very important in this area, as regards language duality, is to remind Canadians that it's a foundational proposition, right? It's fundamental to our country and to its continuity as well, and it's to its cohesion as well. It's also fundamental to a variety of programs. For example, Canadian multiculturalism. Canadian multiculturalism we need to be reminded that it is situated within the context of those two official languages, and that is something that I think needs to be quite explicit as regards our Multiculturalism Act. Right? So there's no ambiguity about such things, which I'll go into more detail in the question period if asked. We also need to remind people that it's not just a need, c'est pas juste un besoin que
It's not just a need that official language minority communities, when it comes to offering services in official languages, it's not just a need, it's a responsibility. And it is a collective responsibility of all citizens of Canada when it comes to official language minority communities. Sometimes we get the impression that it's an offer, but it should be clear that it is a responsibility among our leaders, and that is very clear in our laws and policies.
We need to know via our legislation and other relevant policy documentation that linguistic duality and support for official language minorities is a binding historic commitment to our country. Not doing so can allow some politicians and some pundits to note that there are more Mandarin and Italian speakers in some of our larger provinces, right? You may have heard this from one of our leaders in my neighbor province of Ontario, than there are French speakers. Doing so, I think, transgresses the responsibility and commitment that we have as a country to our language minorities. The language of positive measures, we're hearing talk about that, support of community vitality.
Oui. Je veux juste vous
That's it, I'm running out of
demander,
time.
parce qu'on doit passer aux
Oui, bien sûr.
commentaires des membres pour questions.
Okay.
We must hear the comments of people in the room.
En réponse aux questions peut-être des membres à ce moment-là, je
Okay.
comprends que vous avez...
I understand that you still have things you want to tell us, so we'll start immediately with questions and comments, and I will start with Alupa Clark. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Madam Chouinard, Mr. Genwam. Very pleased that you're here. I think this is the first time you've appeared before the committee. You said it was an honor and a privilege, and we're glad to have offered it to you because it is my office that invited you. I've noticed your expertise, and I would like to hear your thoughts on an administrative tribunal. You mentioned it quite a bit in your introduction, but I do have some specific questions. Before that, Mr. Jedwab, I really liked what you had to say near the end of your introduction about the founding peoples, and in the ambient multiculturalism that we live in, we must never forget this fundamental notion, and I am entirely in agreement with you when it comes to this vision of the country. Ms. Chouinard, without further ado, I think I detected a contradiction that might not be one, but maybe you could elaborate further, because you said since the charter was enshrined, there was an interpretation by the Supreme Court of linguistic rights, but at the same time, you said that with the Official Languages Act that the federal government didn't deliver. I see a contradiction. Could you elaborate? It is in part because the official languages commissioner often hesitated to go before the courts. Therefore, the federal court has not been called upon as often as it could have been. I could have said that there was a time where the courts had liberal and generous interpretations. I'm thinking of the Gascon decision with Section 41. It's along those lines that my comments were intended for. When it comes to the commissioner having more coercive power, or that it has coercive power that it does not necessarily use now, do you think it's that we need to reinforce the commissioner's coercive powers, or would you like us to... What would be the best solution in your opinion? I think we have to choose one or the other right now. If we give coercive power to the commissioner, there's a risk that if the commissioner then goes before the court, they become both judge and complainant. If I had to choose one, honestly, I think I would choose a tribunal if I absolutely had to choose. Well, we are going to choose. What choice would you make? It would be the tribunal? I think the commissioner should be in charge of investigations. And, according to the determinations under a Modernized Languages Act, would have an obligation to provide evidence before the tribunal. But the tribunal would then be the one responsible for imposing sanctions at that point. What would be the benefits of an administrative tribunal? And first of all, would it be an independent tribunal? We would give the responsibility for language rights to that tribunal. Would it be completely separate for official languages? Yes. Same thing as the Human Rights Tribunal. What would be the advantages of that? I think Canadians would hesitate a lot less to go before such a tribunal rather than the federal court. If the law mandated the Official Languages Commissioner to use the institutional memory that exists in the Commissioner's office, you may be aware of some of them, to use its documents as evidence before the tribunal, I think that that would lend strength to the Official Languages Act, and it would send a very clear message to not only the bad students in the class, but to everyone that the Official Languages Act should be taken seriously and there will be consequences. In the law, we talk a great deal about wording and changing should for must, but I have concerns about Section 7, consequences that it could have for the British North America Act, the separation of powers. Do you think that this change in wording should also be done in Section 7, from can to must, when it comes to the separation of powers? I think that's a good question. I think that the federal government could perhaps keep to its own administration. One way of perhaps breathing life into Section 7 would be for the legislator to produce regulations. Yes, I've heard that before, because Section 7 has regulations, but not Section 7. It's like a body without legs. That's the issue that the Gascon decision had raised. We need some details on the implementation of Section 7. If we had them, we would have had a different decision at that time. We need to change the text of Section 7. I think there's a way of breathing life into Section 7 in another way. The Commissioner, speaking with international experts, there's a lot of room for individual idiosyncrasy. As you said, they haven't brought a case before the courts. I'm given to understand that. It's been rare. Please excuse me, the bells are ringing. That means we require the unanimous consent of the committee in order to continue. I'm not sure what's happening. We're checking now. You see the lights flashing? That means we're being called to vote. I need unanimous consent to continue. I have it? Very well. Alupa. That round just ended with you. We're going to move on with René Arsenault. Very quickly, should we not change the commissioner's legislation so that the individual who's there doesn't have to make a decision about whether or not they want to pursue a matter? Should the law not instruct the commissioner that you must act in such a way each time? Yes. Mandate the commissioner to present evidence before the tribunal would be one way of making that a little more effective. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alupa. We're moving on to René Arsenault. Thank you. I don't think I have 7 or 8 minutes to ask all the questions we would like to ask. I have one question for each of you. I'll start with Madame Chouinard. I'll go very quickly. I speak very quickly. Mr. Jedwa is just like you. At the beginning, I thought that the best way to optimize language rights was the tribunal. We heard the commissioner, our only provincial commissioner for New Brunswick, who testified with Mr. Boileau from Ontario, who said that they weren't crazy about that idea because an administrative tribunal would mean that the person who makes the complaint, who wants to uphold their rights, who wants their rights recognized, has to have the burden of proof on them. And a tribunal requires lawyers, and they won't necessarily want to do that. It's complicated. It's lengthy. People give up. I heard, as you were saying earlier, that the Commissioner of Wales, for me, that was an incredible breath of fresh air. I think that this leads me to my next question. 1, I think that the administrative tribunal as such is not the solution. It's part of a solution. But to go back to what Michel Carrier for New Brunswick and Mr. Boileau said, the law needs to be clear. And it needs to be subject to so little discretion and interpretation that it doesn't lead to legal debates at the federal court or elsewhere. Therefore, we need to really give the law some teeth as well as some clarity. Also, this Commissioner for Wales, who said that had very few decisions appealed to court. And the only ones who wanted to use the administrative tribunal, there's very little call upon lawyers to go before a tribunal. Maybe around with the commissioner, we need to give them the role to impose sanctions, not just to investigate.
And then we let society, the Crown, or anybody who's not respecting the law to deal with the administrative court. What do you think? So clarify the act and administrative tribunal, like what we see in Wales. Thank you very much for your questions. First of all, clarifying the act. It hasn't been 50 years that I've been here on Earth, but if I look at the parliamentary debates with regard to linguistic rights in Canada, there has always been a compromise. And often the legislator has left some clauses vague, either in the Charter or in the Act, talking about political courage. I would dare say that is required. It would be a challenge to make the Act clear than clear itself, but it would be a good challenge for legislators to undertake. With regard to the other issue, it is true that the creation of a tribunal would mean some difficulties for individuals, but they could do this without going through the official languages commissioner. That means that if somebody feels their rights have been violated and the commissioner says, well, we're not going to investigate for reason X, Y, or Z, there is another recourse. There is the court challenges program that could also be used. Yes, but that is already in place. The Human Rights Commissioner, for example, in New Brunswick, this is done. So there can be an investigation. They take the complainant by the hand. They aren't worried about wasting time or paying the bill. The commissioner can play that role and say, these are your rights, you're right or not. And the commissioner has said that there have been no financial sanctions, but rather that a report be produced saying how you're going to respect the act. That's heavy and tiring for the Crown Corporation that would have to do that. There is an element missing here in that equation. For example, there is the Welsh language scheme that is developed with each of the institutions, and we don't see that here in the Official Languages Act. I haven't seen anyone propose it either. This means that based on the Act, all of the institutions must sit down with the Official Languages Commission in Wales, for example, to say, here's how we see our obligations, and each institution has a roadmap, if you will. So this would be something that could be looked at if you wish to follow the Welsh example. I have 30 seconds left. I'd like to pull that elastic. So how can we explain that after 150 years of existence in the country and 50 years of the Official Languages Act in Canada, we don't have this kind of pride in our society, this pride that our languages are in fact something to be proud of. They're part of us. I think people are too timid. If we look at the evolution of our country, at one time, we were prepared to violate the rights of minorities. We have changed course in the 60s and 70s, and 80s, but the approach is too timid. And with regard to our collective responsibility to minorities, it's not clear. I'm not saying you're timid here around this table, but there was a time when the approach was too timid. We needed a critical mass in some provinces. People felt that they were disadvantaged compared to bilingual individuals, and this makes the elected officials a bit timid. And sometimes for political reasons, these issues are exploited sometimes. For example, in New Brunswick, we see this. And with great respect for the Premier of Ontario, we have seen cases where he's attempted to see what people's reactions would be and to exploit public's insecurities with regard to the rights that should be recognized to provide services to a Francophone minority. This should be recognized as a right and not a privilege or a favor given to those minority communities. And all too often, there are people think that this is a privilege or a favor. And we must insist that these are rights. Thank you very much, Jack. We'll move on to François Choquette. Thank you, both of you, for that presentation. It is extremely interesting and allows us to think about how to modernize the Official Languages Act. I'd like to start with Mr. Jedwab for my first question. You talked about the importance of continuing to expand the number of people who are bilingual. Of course, those who speak French and English. You mentioned the fact that our face changes, our identity changes. There are people who are bilingual, but who don't necessarily speak French or English. There was a situation, and I think the commissioner, and you were here when the commissioner appeared, the commissioner mentioned that it would have been important to have a forum of federal, provincial, territorial first ministers to celebrate that linguistic duality in order to bring people together, to celebrate those who speak both official languages. What do you think Are there other ways, in your opinion, to promote bilingualism in Canada? Well, it is difficult with First Minister's meeting, given their demographics and constraints. But there are a number of organizations across the country who would be prepared, and we will see it this year, who would be prepared to celebrate the advancements we've made in the area of linguistic duality and bilingualism, despite the fact that I've said that there was some timidity. We have seen significant progress. And we have things to build together. If I may give you an example, a concrete example of this, we see through the census. I have the opportunity to study these censuses, and we see there have been investments in immersion, and we celebrate immersion schools with full enrollment or even a waiting list. Often we see this outside Quebec in situations where people who learned French as a second language after some 10 years, we've seen a change in the census with regard to their ability to speak that second language because there isn't enough opportunity or interaction for them to do it in both official languages. That's why it's important to have living communities to give this opportunity. Ms. Chouinard, you talked about the commissioner's power to appeal to the federal court, something that rarely happens, and that the commissioner can be part of appeals by individuals. This is important, but what concerns me is the commissioner's powers of investigation. Let me explain. The commissioner has very broad investigative powers to require appearances, documents, explanations. To my knowledge, he does this very rarely. My personal experience, because I filed a number of complaints with the Office of the Commissioner, and I see the scope of the investigation. I've asked for it, and they've refused to give it to me. I've asked this, and they've refused to answer. Why has this not been used? Why has this power not been used? So even to go before the federal courts, I wonder if we don't need to reinforce this investigative power, not necessarily reinforce what's already there, but the obligation to conduct those investigations. Thank you for that question. I think you're right. And I think your question goes in the same vein as Mr. Clark's on the commissioner's powers. One of the problems that we see is the lack of resources at the Office of the Commissioner. I know that in terms of research, very little is being done, whereas in the past there was a whole research unit, to the point that the Official Languages Commissioner calls on people like us regularly at that when he wants to have an idea of what research is underway. So to me, this speaks to the need within that office. Also, Mr. Clark mentioned various issues, but currently there are a number of things that depend on the commissioner's personality. And they're not sometimes lawyers, and there has been a learning curve that has not occurred necessarily at the Office of the Official Languages Commissioner to use those powers. It's set out in the Act, but they're not used with the full force that they could be. To conclude, under what circumstances would the Commissioner have the right to appeal to the federal court? Do you have examples of situations where this could be an obligation when there are institutions that continue to repeat mistakes? This would be my first thought. It's not baseball. We can't say 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. That's not how it works. But in my opinion, there is an inherent problem in the fact that year after year we read the commissioner's reports And it's often always the same institutions that are failing to respect the Official Languages Act, and there are no consequences. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francois. I think Manuela and Daryl, you too. I think it's me replacing my friend. We know what we're doing over here. Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Jedwab and Ms. Chouinard. It's always very interesting to see the different perspectives and to hear about the vision. Ms. Chouinard, I must congratulate you. You do very interesting work in the area of research. Research is essential, in my opinion, to help to develop the road forward. I think this identifies problems and possible solutions. You finished talking about the commissioner's reports, and I don't know if you were here when the commissioner responded to my questions, but he was talking about 20%. 30% is easy, the complaints are easily resolved. 50% are also easily resolved, but there's some 20% where it's problematic. And you've just referred to that 20%. So I asked him to provide us the names of those institutions and the types of problems. Do you have any feedback for us in this regard? Do you want me to name names? I'm not sure I understand your question. Well, do you have a few examples of the types of problems within the 20% of the complaints that are difficult or extremely difficult to resolve? I think one of the most obvious examples, and there is where the legal recourse has proven very limited, is Air Canada, where the Supreme Court overturned the decision that Air Canada provide damages to Mr. Thibodeau for infringing his linguistic rights. Air Canada has a great deal of difficulty respecting its commitments in this area. There are other transportation services via rail. I often see them too often over the course of a year, but I've never had problems being served in both official languages or the official language of my choice there. Okay. You spoke a little bit earlier about the court cases that are interpreted in one way liberally and others less so. And the court case we talked about just a moment ago was limited. When we talk about clarifying the act, it's almost impossible to put everything in the act. There are always interpretations, questions. That is why I've always liked the fact that the Supreme Court seemed to have a much more liberal approach. In other words, there's no need to stipulate everything that's allowed, and rather to say, here are the 2 or 3 things that aren't allowed, and everything else is going okay. To me, it's a different approach. The danger is that whether it's in Canada or the U.S., it's the party in power that picks the judges who are appointed. We can have some liberal judges appointed or others, and that's where we have some issues. We've no doubt always had good results, but we're talking about common law, and we can build on that. So I give you the floor. I think the issue you've identified is the problem of the chicken or the egg. Yes, in fact, the official languages minority community or communities often have to go to the courts. But on the other hand, what's the other option? I could refer, as Mr. Jedwab did, to what is happening in Ontario at present. I know that there's a move to the courts with regard to services in French and the commissioner. When the legislator doesn't want to hear from you, then you need recourse. And so there is not many other avenues. Thank you very much, Daryl. Your time is up. We'll let Emanuela conclude. 2 minutes.
Question is for you.
Monsieur,
A lot about how bilingualism would help minority communities and how being more open to speaking both languages would obviously help the vitality of these communities. However, obviously, it's not as easy. Obviously, I'm an Anglophone from Quebec, and in Montreal, there are both languages that are spoken quite regularly, and a lot of people speak English in Montreal. However, in other areas like Quebec City, Trois-Rivières, other cities across Quebec, where these languages are not spoken and they're not encouraged as much either. And when there are governments such as the one that has been elected where they barely have any seats in Montreal, and so not much of the political capital is there, how can we help maintain, these communities in these other areas when like, for example, the abolition of school boards will mainly affect the English-speaking minority. In what ways do you think the federal government can act in order to help, in this situation when obviously the people's voices won't necessarily be heard?
Yeah, I think there are challenges associated with advancing the condition of some of those communities, particularly the ones outside of Montreal. But there are also challenges for English speakers in Montreal, as we know as well. Again, these are all connected to the politics and jurisdictional disputes and respective interests of some of the elected officials as they determine, that protection of French, which is a valid objective in Quebec, is in some ways threatened by the presence of the English language and the communities that articulate or express themselves in that language. And we've seen episodes of how that plays itself out. I know the time's limited, so I will say this. The best way the federal government can help in that there are sort of administrative arrangements and understandings we know about, for example, in immigration, where if you're an English-speaking immigrant and you come to Quebec, the extent to which you'll be recognized as such by the government of Quebec because of the administrative arrangements that everyone seems reasonably comfortable with not shaking up, is challenging. But the federal government can offer more resources in those particular areas without necessarily contravening the jurisdictional issues for Quebec to assist those communities in various ways to secure and to continue to operate in their languages. One of the ways that I think I was going to suggest, and I know time's running short, to help communities in general is with investing considerably in technologies, at least insofar as federal services are concerned, and ensuring that our technologies that are going to increasingly be areas where people secure services are provided in both English and French as widely as possible, so that some of the geographic situation you find yourself in is at least in part remedied by our ability to furnish services. I want to ensure that my robots are bilingual. Right, I think it's very, very important. And my voice assistants, even though they pronounce chemin de carry very badly, right, as opposed to chemin de carré, right, that they are also able to communicate effectively in both languages, and that we invest considerably as a country in ensuring that we maximize the opportunity for communities, given their geographic circumstances, to be able to benefit to the best degree possible from the technologies that will, in future, provide lots of services that were otherwise not provided that way.
Merci beaucoup, Jack. Merci beaucoup, Stéphanie.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Stephanie, for the speeches and presentations that you gave. We will adjourn until Thursday. That is our next meeting. Thank you very much.